Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Today, the 63rd governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour. In 2003, Mr. Barbour was elected governor of Mississippi, becoming only the second Republican to do so since Reconstruction. In 2007, he won re-election to a second and, because of term limits, final term. Since June of last year, Governor Barbour has served as chairman of the Republican Governors Association. An item in Politico this very week referred to him in his capacity as chairman of the Republican Governors Association as, quote, the most powerful man in Republican politics, close quote. First question, Governor. You grew up in Mississippi at a time when the term the Solid South still meant the solidly Democratic South. 21, 22 years old, you skipped out on a semester at Ole Miss to go to work on the 1968 campaign of Republican Richard Nixon, and you've been in Republican politics ever since. What possessed you?
Well, to be a Republican in Mississippi in 1968, Peter, you did have to take the long-term view. First time I ever saw a poll was during the 1968 campaign. I'd never seen a political poll, but that year, 6% of Mississippians identified themselves as Republicans. 6. Now, Nixon didn't do well in Mississippi in 1968 because of George Wallace. But in 1972, it was his highest percentage of the vote in the country for Nixon. But more importantly, we elected 2 young Republican congressmen in 1972, Trent Lott and Thad Cochran. Both became giants in the Senate, and today we have not only a Republican governor, but 7 of our 8 state elected officials are Republicans, and both of our United States senators. So I don't know what possessed me other than my oldest brother came home from the Army, a Goldwater Republican, in 1965, and in that spring of 68, he ran for mayor of Yazoo City, Mississippi, quit his job at the bank, and the Republicans didn't have a line on the ballot, so he had to run as an independent. We had to get a petition so that he could get on the ballot, but I got a kick out of it. So I dropped out of college, as you said. I was at Ole Miss, and I dropped out the fall of my senior year to work in the presidential campaign. I wouldn't give anything for it.
Your brother was the influence. Your dad died when you were a little boy, as I recall.
My daddy died when I was 2 years old. My dad was a Democratic elected official. His daddy was a Democratic elected official. He was a circuit judge, and we were Eastland Democrats. There was a senator from Mississippi named Jim Eastland, and my grandfather was Mr. Eastland's daddy's lawyer. It's a pretty small state, and was a real small state in the 1930s and 40s. So even though we went back that way, I've always thought if my father had lived to 1970 or 1980, that he would have become a Republican. His little brother, who was my senior law partner, did. Interestingly, my parents' generation became Republicans after their children became Republicans.
Haley, excuse me, I should call you governor. We've better stipulate we've known each other for a long time, but you're the governor. And
people have been calling me Haley a whole lot longer than they call me governor. So, Peter, you can call me whatever you want to.
All right. Well, let's take this on right away. 1968, there's still talk about Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, and that the reason that white folks in the South, Mississippi, the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, that they became Republican was race. It was a reaction against the Civil Rights Acts and the advances that African Americans were making in the South.
Well, there's no question that in the 50s and probably in the 60s there was some of that. At the same time, the people that led the change of parties in the South, just as I mentioned earlier, was my generation.
Right.
My generation who went to integrated schools, or I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it. And it was the old Democrats who had fought for segregation so hard. By my time, people realized that was the past. It was indefensible. It wasn't going to be that way anymore. And so the people who really changed the South from Democrat to Republican was a different generation from those who fought integration. In fact, I can never forget when I mentioned we elected these 2 young congressmen, and we were just itching to get a senator. And one of my friends said, well, Haley, we're just a few funerals away. That you had some of the old crowd that just wasn't ever going to give up on the Democratic Party because it was the party of the Civil War, segregation. And some of those people gave up on it, and a lot of those people just aren't here anymore.
Haley, our governor, you ran for the Senate yourself in 1982. You lost by about 2.5 or 3 to 1 because your opponent was John Cornelius Stennis, who has an aircraft carrier named after him, was a legendary figure in the Senate and one of the great men of Mississippi. And one of the Democrats you're talking about, is that roughly when the generational change is taking place? There's young Haley Barbour stepping forward as a Republican, and there's John Stennis as a representative of the Old South. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It's kind of a pivot point. Actually, I got to be 64 to 36, but I never expected your math to be very good. But that's not new. And Senator Stennis was a revered person. Yes, he was a segregationist, but he wasn't mean. He wasn't somebody who was waved the bloody shirt. He did what his generation did. And when I ran against him in 1982, we were in the transition. We weren't anything like a Republican state. Ronald Reagan carried Mississippi in 1980 with 51% of the vote.
Oh, was it that close?
Yes, sir. And by 1984,
I had not remembered that.
Back to 84, it blew out the top.
Right.
But it was sort of the transition that ran from the late 60s when we were minuscule, that by the 80s we were starting to become competitive. And then as we went through the 80s and 90s, the Democrats started receding. And as I say, part of it was demographic because a lot of old people who had stayed faithful to the Democratic Party weren't there anymore. And a couple of other things, urbanization, industrialization, really homogenization. You know, Jackson, Mississippi became a whole lot more like Jackson, Michigan than it had ever been before. Interstates, McDonald's, you could, you know.
The South joined the rest of the United States in some way.
That's exactly right. And I'll tell you at the same time, the United States became more like the South. It was a two-way, like most things in life, it was a two-way transition.
Segment 2, from Mississippi and a long time ago to the nation today, 37 races. That's the number of gubernatorial elections that are going to take place this November. For some months now, as chairman of the Republican Governors Association, you've been working hard. You've been crisscrossing the country. Here you are in California today. You've been raising money. You've raised some $40 million, according to the most recent reports, all on behalf of these 37 gubernatorial candidates. Why do those 37 candidates matter so much to the governor of Mississippi?
Well, of course, one of the great legacies of Ronald Reagan is his states count. We did have some devolution of power back away from the federal government to the states. So it matters who your governor is. Look at California and look at the differences. And if state policies here were more like some other states, California would be in a whole lot better shape. So, it matters who's the governor for state purposes. Secondly, and very importantly, the governors who are elected this year will preside over redistricting. The census this year means that we must reapportion, redistrict, both the U.S. House and both houses of the state legislature in the next 2 years. 39 governors have a role in reapportionment. Many of them can veto the redistricting plan. That matters. Suppose the Republicans gain 45 seats in the House this year, gives us a 5-seat majority, and then we get gerrymandered out of 30 seats in the redistricting. So it matters for the House of Representatives and for the legislature. Of course, it matters who's governor of a state in a presidential election. If you've got an attractive, aggressive, hardworking Republican governor in a state, it's worth a couple of points in the presidential election of 2012. Finally, finally, there is a correlation that is not well recognized that very rarely do you get a Republican senator, a new Republican senator elected to replace a Democrat if the same day we lose the governor's race in that state. Almost a zero correlation for the last 17 years. 27 states this year have both a governor's race and a Senate race. So there's a real effect on Senate races as well. So just however you look at it, these governor's races count. You know as well as I, public policy-wise, often it's the states that generate new and appropriate public policies.
I wanted to ask you about that. You mentioned that it's a legacy of the Reagan years that states count more than they used to do. Are we seeing governors stand up in a way that makes states count even more today? Governors stand up to the Obama administration. 20 states, Mississippi's one of them, have filed suit I have joined a suit in Florida that challenges the constitutionality of Obamacare. You had Bobby Jindal. I want to come to this in a moment, but Bobby Jindal, particularly during the oil spill, saying this is the way the spill should be handled. The federal government's got it wrong here and here and here. You've got Mitch Daniels in Indiana saying Obamacare is bad for the people of my state, and this is why. The challenge to Washington seems, I'm arguing, I want to see what you make of it, to be centered not so much among Republicans in the House or Senate as in the Republican state houses across the country.
In fairness to the Republicans in the House and Senate, leadership and rank and file, look, when you're in the minority, particularly in the House, all you can do is vote.
Right.
You can oppose. If you propose, it's never going to see the light of day. The news media won't even cover it. So I don't want to talk that down.
All right.
But what's going on here is that the Obama administration is taking steps that are unprecedented in American history to gather power to the federal government. I mean, there is nowhere in the Constitution or in American history that it's ever been said that the federal government has the power to force you and every American to buy a product, whether that product is health insurance, automobiles, or candy bars. There is nowhere in American political history that the federal government has ever assumed to itself the power to force every American to buy some product. And that's no more in the Commerce Clause than the man in the moon. So that is why governors have stepped up. I mean, we have health care programs. They're about to make our health care programs outrageously more expensive. You know that half the people who are going to get, quote, health insurance out of the Obama bill are going to be stuck on Medicaid? 15, 16 million people will just be added to the Medicaid rolls. In my state, Medicaid rolls are going to go up 50%, and it's going to cost the taxpayers of Mississippi about $240, $260 million a year. That's 5% of my total state budget, $250 million. And there's no way we can get that except raise taxes. But that is being forced on us by a health care bill. When you and I and most everybody who watches this thought of health care reform, we thought it would save money.
Right.
In fact, it's going to make the cost of health care go up.
Right. Few predictions. How many of those 37 gubernatorial races are we going to win?
I will tell you, there are more competitive races than you can imagine. I mean, when we're ahead in Oregon, when we're ahead in Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, all 6, it looks good for us, but we'll never forget, month's a light year in politics.
Right.
The election's not now. The election is a month and a half away.
You were chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1994 when Republicans picked up 54 seats in the House of Representatives to recapture the House for the first time in 4 decades. How does the political climate in November 1994 for Republicans compare with the political climate for Republicans today?
For more than a year, I have said the political environment is better for Republicans than it was in 1994. This, way back in the summer of 2009, because of health care, when the American people were concerned about jobs and the economy, and all they heard Congress and the administration talk about was health care, the American people started getting mad. And the intensity of this started so much earlier than it did in 1994. Anger, at fear. People are scared for their country's future, scared for their children and grandchildren, scared for their businesses. And this started months and months and months ago. My fear the whole time has been that it would kind of reach a crescendo too early. The Scott Brown race in January, I was tickled that he won, but I'll tell you, scared me. Is this going to let the air out of the balloon?
But it hasn't happened. The polls show.
That's right. It has continued. In fact, you can make the case it's gotten stronger. The numbers in the polling have certainly gotten better for Republicans. But we cannot assume that means we're home free. You know, there's a great political saying, you got to run the hardest when the wind's at your back, because that's when you got to get all the ground you can get between you and your opponent. So he's got a heck of a lot more to make up. So we got to keep our foot on the accelerator, shoulder of the wheel, take nothing for granted. I do think it is more likely than not we'll elect a majority of the House as Republicans.
More likely than not.
I think more likely than not. I think probably we'll get in the mid to high 40s in the Senate. And I feel pretty certain that we'll get 30 or more governors. Right now it's 26 Democrats, 24 Republicans. If the election were today, we'd probably get 33, 34 Republicans. But I suspect we'll get at least 30.
Next segment here, Barack Obama and the Republican Party. Listen to Charles Krauthammer's summary of what's happened. Quote, the president has delivered more for liberalism in a year and a half than any president in 50 years. He's given them national health care. He's given them heavy regulation on finance. He gave them $1 trillion to spend on every wish list that the liberals have had for the last 2 decades. He's given them 2 appointments to the Supreme Court, each of which will yield a quarter century of liberal opinions. He bailed out unions in the auto takeover. He's bailed out the teachers' unions. He's given the liberals everything he possibly could. Close quote. Polls show that 20% of Americans call themselves liberals, 40% call themselves conservatives, and 40% call themselves independents. Only 20% liberals, and those are the folks this administration seems to be paying almost exclusive attention to. You're a professional. What are the president and his advisors thinking?
Well, look, there's only one possible answer. They're true believers. This is the biggest lurch to the left in American political history. There's never been a time in American political history, you go back to the 1790s, where you have seen the government policy move so far and so fast to the left. And this is a very left administration with a very left Congress. I mean, Peter, when you and I were in Washington in the 1980s, and we thought about Nancy Pelosi, Henry Waxman, Ed Markey.
They were the fringe.
The lunatic fringe. We thought they were the left of the House Democratic Caucus. Now they run it. Lock, stock, and barrel. They run it. And they, for conservative Democrats, of which there are about 3, but even for moderate Democrats, of which there are a few, they cram it down their throats. And they make them vote for very left-wing stuff, or because they've got a big enough majority, they pass stuff without their support, stuff that some of these Democrats are against, some of these moderate Democrats. But it left in the House and just as far left in the Senate. When they can get every Democrat to vote on the health care bill, even to the point where the Republicans, to embarrass them, put up an amendment that said the government cannot subsidize Viagra for sex offenders. The Democrats voted down. Now, I'm sure most of them in practice would have agreed that shouldn't be done.
Crazy.
But they just were going to put this bill on the president's desk, and if they could vote the most horrible vote, that's what they had to do. That's what they did. The discipline that the Democrats have had has been pretty remarkable for some stuff that is very, very left-wing.
All right. To be as steeped in politics as you are is to be steeped in American history. So let me ask you to think like a historian. Answer me this. You mentioned when we were in the Reagan White House in the 80s. Ronald Reagan cut taxes, rolled back regulations, controlled domestic spending, and what happened? 25 years of economic expansion. And now we see the reverse, this lurch to the left. Why? Where did this come from? Nancy Pelosi didn't just, this didn't happen and this wasn't a coup. They were elected. Don't you, do you find, how did it happen? Do you feel frustrated with the American democracy that we seem to have learned something, and now all the lessons as if Ronald Reagan had never existed?
Well, first of all, I feel frustrated with the Republicans. We brought on ourselves. Spending, too much spending, and I think George Bush is a friend of mine. I'm very fond of him. I think he was so fixated on the war on terror that he made the decision, we'll give the Democrats and the left more spending to keep them at bay so that they won't really go out and fight me hard on the war on terror. But a lot of our base became disillusioned, felt like we'd lost our way. And the other thing is, Peter, the nature of the cycle is it's very hard for one party to keep the White House for more than one term. Since World War II, that's happened once. I mean, I said more than one term, more than 2 terms, more than one 2-term presidency.
Right.
And we did it with Bush. And frankly,
George H.W.
That's right, Daddy Bush. And we did it because the American people decided they didn't want Michael Dukakis as president.
Right.
You know, we should never forget, those of us who like to think it's because they wanted Reagan to have a third term. The fact of the matter is Bush was behind 18 points in May and again in August, which sort of shoots our argument down a little bit. But the American people said, we don't want Dukakis, so we got a third term. Other than that, in mine and your lifetime, no party has kept the White House for a third term. And so we were due to lose. But we lost to a group that did a fairly good job of disguising, for the average person at least, their goals for moving so far to the left. I think some people who were really paying attention to his record could see it coming. But the news media certainly wasn't trumpeting his record.
No. All right, to the Republican Party here and the correct response to Barack Obama. George Will talked not long ago about the birth of the GOP. And he laid out, this was on television one Sunday morning, he laid out Senator Stephen Douglas, a Democrat of Illinois, proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which might have permitted slavery to be expanded into Kansas and Nebraska. And here's George Will, quote, "A lawyer from Springfield, Illinois named Lincoln said no." Now, was the Republican Party the party of no? You bet they were, and it was a good thing. Close quote. Is the GOP, once again, properly the party of no?
Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with being the party of no when what you're stopping is bad policy. And I'll be tickled to be the party of no as long as we're stopping or trying to stop things that are bad for the country. Because at the end of the day, the party and the people who are elected on the party's label, their job is to solve real problems and to deal with problems in a way that the American people recognize. I may not agree with that guy all the time, but he's trying to do the right thing. We're making progress. And trust the people enough to tell them the truth. That was one of the things that when I was chairman of the party, I always tried to emphasize. The American people are strong and tough and smart. They can take the truth. You tell them the truth, and they can deal with it. I had to do that after Katrina. And that's what's expected. Common sense, truth-telling. And the Republicans are telling people what they know is the truth about this spending spree. Our country can't spend itself rich, just like your family can't spend itself rich. And you watch, Peter, we're about to see Obama come out with the great compromise on the deficit. He's going to say, you Republicans are so against the deficit, you agree to raise taxes, I'll agree to cut spending. The problem is not the deficit. The problem is spending.
Right.
And raising taxes is the enemy of controlling spending.
Next segment, the issues. I'm just going to name issues. You tell me where you'd like to see Republicans stand on these issues. Obamacare.
Excuse me.
Was it the mere mention of Obamacare?
Obamacare.
Yep.
We should try to repeal it. We should try to do everything between 2010 and 2012 to impede its furtherance. Won't be able to stop everything, but we'll be able to slow some things down and stop some things. And if we defeat Obama in 2012, we should try to repeal it. We should come back and have some piecemeal in the right word, but deal with specific issues about health care reform that are needed, not a government takeover of health care.
And you're not worried at all about getting labeled the obstructionist party. Between you win a majority in the House, you're predicting that we'll pick up seats in the Senate, but not a majority in the Senate. And so what you can do, if you've got a majority in the House and a minority in the Senate, and the White House held by Barack Obama, is just get in his way. That's all you can do.
First of all, to do that is good policy. Second of all, to do that's good politics. Missouri, maybe the best bellwether state in the United States, just had a referendum in which virtually no money was spent on, do you want Obamacare in Missouri or not? 71% of people voted not to have Obamacare. So if you're worried about the politics of it are good. More importantly, the policy of stopping Obamacare is the right policy.
Spending. The Obama administration has expanded federal spending from the modern historical norm of about 20% of GDP to 25% of GDP. As percentages of GDP, federal spending and the federal deficit We used to listen in the Reagan years to, the way he's running up the deficit. It's a tiny deficit by comparison with Barack Obama's deficit. Spending and the deficit are now the highest since the Second World War. What should Republicans do about that?
Cut spending. And when I say cut spending, I mean cut spending. When you and I were in the White House and the Washington Post referred to spending cuts, what they meant was certain spending account was supposed to go up 8%. It's only going to go up 5%. So that's a 3% cut. Well, the budget of the state of Mississippi for the fiscal year that started last month is 13% less than it was 2 years ago. Not 13% less we thought it'd be. It is 13% less. You can cut spending. States are doing it all over the country. And we need to cut spending because that is the problem. It's not that we tax too little. It's that we spend too much.
Entitlements. Social Security is dipping into the red this year. It'll go into the black for a couple of years. Then it goes into the red forever. Medicare, Medicaid, both big problems. Baby boomers retiring. The federal government faces over the next 2-3 decades trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities. Republican position?
You got to control entitlement spending. I mean, you cannot say we're going to cut spending but not entitlements. And the idea that you can't cut entitlement spending, the Obama administration just cut Medicare spending $500 billion. The problem is they didn't save it for Medicare in the future. They took that $500 billion away from Medicare beneficiaries and they gave it to give somebody else health insurance. What we should have been doing is getting Medicare healthier, getting it on a more even keel, and we can do that. Of course, when we were in the White House, we had the Social Security changes that extended in retirement age. Yeah, I'm 62 years old. I'll be 63 this fall. I hope if I live, I'm going to work well past 70. And as people get older and older and older, it is very reasonable that Social Security, full Social Security, should be delayed to age 70. There's just no question that that can be done. Young people, frankly, young people would have a better choice if they took their money and put it in a savings account. You know, people say, oh, the stock market crash shows that you shouldn't let people have private accounts. Social Security, if you let those young people put their money just in the deposit account at the passbook savings account at the bank, they'd come out better, you know, if they live a full life. The bad thing is we've got entitlements, 3 huge entitlements that are out of control spending-wise. The third one's Medicaid.
Right.
And I have cut Medicaid. My first 5 years as governor of Mississippi, Medicaid spending went up 1.7% a year. So you can control Medicaid spending. I got the lowest error rate in the United States in Mississippi because we make sure everybody on Medicaid is legally on there. We make every one of them personally come in and reestablish their eligibility annually. And we save money. But what I was going to say, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid that you've been talking about, right, they are huge budget problems. So what does Obama do? Well, we got 3 entitlements are out of control. Let's get a 4th one. So they do Obamacare. Here's the 4th $1 trillion entitlement. It is going in exactly the wrong direction.
Immigration. By the way, let me tell you, 2% of the population of Mississippi is Hispanic. You've got a population of about 3 million total. You're sitting in a state here in California where you've got an estimated somewhere between 5 to 7 million illegal immigrants or aliens right here in California. So I want to hear what the governor of Mississippi says that will resonate with folks here in California.
Well, let me just tell you, I've had a different experience than perhaps some other governors. I don't know where we would have been in Mississippi after Katrina if it hadn't been for the Spanish speakers that came in to help rebuild. And there's no doubt in my mind some of them weren't here illegally. Some of them were, some of them weren't. But they came in, they looked for the work. If they hadn't been there, if they hadn't come and stayed for a few months or a couple of years, we would be way, way, way behind where we are now. Every country, I don't care if it's the United States of America or Papua New Guinea, every country has got to have a secure border. If you can't secure your border, you're not much of a country, and we've got to secure our border. But we got to do so with the recognition that even in our lifetime, we're going to have a labor shortage in the United States. We don't want to be like Japan, where the aging population is supported by fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer. So there's got to be a way to, A, we got to secure the border. But B, we've got to work through how are we going to make sure we got the labor we need in the United States. H-1B visas, a huge, huge thing. My idea is everybody from Stanford who's from India that gets a PhD, we ought to stamp citizenship on his diploma. So instead of him going back to India and starting a business that employs 1,800 people, that he'll start a business that employs 1,800 people in Des Moines, Iowa, instead of India. A lot of this is just common sense. And common sense tells us we're not going to take 10 or 12 or 14 million people and put them in jail and deport them. We say we're not going to do it, and we need to quit. Some people need to quit acting like we are, and let's talk about real solutions.
Last issue I want to mention to you right now. You've got 37 candidates running for governor. Do you want them to just stay away from the Ground Zero Mosque?
No, I mean, whatever they think.
What do you think?
I think it's an awful thing. I think it is an absolute, determined attempt to stick a finger in people's eye. I was very interested. Nancy Pelosi on TV the other day appeared to be saying she wanted to know, she demanded to know where was the money coming from to support the opposition to the mosque. A better question is, where's the money coming from for the mosque?
Right. And that the fellow who's behind the mosque had gone on the record, as I recall, within the previous 48 hours, refusing to rule out contributions from Saudi Arabia or Iran. And
refusing to say whether he thought Hamas, a obvious terrorist organization, was a terrorist organization.
Next segment, Governor. A governor at work. You take office in January 2004. Next August, Hurricane Katrina hits. You come out of that catastrophe one of the few office holders in the entire country whose poll standings are enhanced. How'd you pull that off?
The people of Mississippi are strong, reliable, resilient, self-reliant people. When people looked at what happened on the TV, they probably couldn't tell that Mississippi bore the brunt of the hurricane. New Orleans had a terrible tragedy, but it was a rising water flood after the fact their levees broke. It was a terrible thing. My coastline was obliterated. We had about 70,000 homes statewide that were uninhabitable. Hurricane force winds 240 miles north. A third of the fatalities in our state weren't on the coast. It was more than a coastal calamity. Yet our people got up the next day, been knocked flat, and they hitched up their britches and went to work. And they not only went to work helping themselves, they went to work helping their neighbors. And that was so critical. Our people came back to their communities. We got the schools open. Every public school in Mississippi was open before any public school in New Orleans. People had to have a place for the kids to go to school. The employers, except for the casino industry, the big employers all back open in the 4 months left in the year. The casinos had to float under state law. Well, they've been wanting to come on land for years. Well, a bunch of them came on land. Those big barges just ended up 2 or 3 blocks inland and ran over buildings. But at any rate, that's why they were later coming back. But jobs, schools, and then housing. We had at one point 47,000 temporary FEMA trailers for people to live in Mississippi. But we got it done pretty dang fast, and people came home. You saw, if you watched TV then, Mississippi wasn't on 10% of the time, but you could see Mississippians aren't into victimhood. They weren't looking for somebody to blame. They're just doing what they had to do.
More recent catastrophe, the oil leak. Thousands of barrels a day for 80 days. The Obama administration could have, there are a lot of things they could have waived the Jones Act. They could have permitted Louisiana to dredge up sand berms the way Governor Jindal asked them for permission. They could have waived EPA regulations and would have made it easier to skim the oil. And above all, they could have refrained from imposing a moratorium on deep water drilling that shut down a lot of jobs. You, a governor of a state right there on the Gulf, would not attack the Obama administration. How come?
If you've been through an unprecedented disaster like we went through with Katrina, and you recognize that the BP oil spill was unprecedented. We've had more than 30,000 oil wells in the last 50 years drilled in the Gulf of Mexico, and nothing like this has ever happened. So it was an unprecedented, unforeseen disaster. And yeah, the administration was slow on the uptake. And some of the planning that had been done in previous years, going back to Exxon Valdez, turned out not to be very applicable. But I'm very reluctant to criticize somebody for an imperfect response, because I've seen when you get hit by the worst natural disaster in American history, anybody that thinks everything's going to go according to oil just doesn't know what they're talking about.
You get elected governor. You're facing a $720 million deficit. That's about, 13, 14% of the budget?
Today it is. Back then it was about 20%.
20% of the budget. Both houses of your legislature are in the hands of the Democrats. You got rid of that deficit without raising taxes. How'd you do that? And how you work with it across the aisle there? Is it because your Democrats back home are such conservative folks that you really share fundamental values in common? How does that work in Mississippi?
There was a time when our legislature was almost nonpartisan. But the House today is very much more partisan. 72 Democrats, 50 Republicans, and the House is much more partisan. However, there are some conservative Democrats. And finally, we took the message to the public. Mm-hmm. Do you want a tax increase, or do you want to get control of spending? And by about 75 to 15, the public says we ought to control spending rather than raise taxes. And they're right. As I said about the federal government, our problem wasn't that we were taxing too little. We just got to spending too much, and we controlled it. The other thing, very importantly, we grew the economy. Mm. If you want your revenue to go up, don't raise tax rates. Get more taxpayers with more taxable income. That's what's going to be wrong with Obama here if they let the Bush tax cuts or some of the Bush tax cuts expire. They're going to see that doesn't increase revenue. It's going to cost revenue. Get more people working, then your revenue goes up.
Final segment here. I've got to get you out of this studio pretty quickly, so let me move quickly through this. The man from Dixie. Throughout your years in Washington, Reagan White House, you worked for George H.W. Bush, you serve as chairman of the RNC, you open a lobbying firm. You flew back home to Yazoo City every weekend you could. Your wife stayed in Yazoo City to raise your two kids, as I recall, two boys. Why'd you do that? Why didn't you buy a big townhouse in Georgetown or one of those big places over in McLean?
It started, I was only going to stay at the White House for 2 years, and our younger son was going to be in the first grade. And we just thought it would be very dislocating to take him up there, go to the first grade, half of the second grade, turn and go back. We like where we live, and we're comfortable there. Both my boys graduated from high school in Yazoo City, Mississippi, because we chose to and because I could. As time went on, we thought about, particularly after both the boys finished high school, but about then, I was starting to think about the future, and at any rate, it worked for us. And Marcia says we've been married 39 years and we've been together 12.
All right.
Absence makes the heart grow fonder.
So you keep your home in Yazoo City, even when you're working in Washington. You go home, you get elected governor. You and I have known each other for a long time. Let me tell you what I've been hearing for the last year or 18 months from a lot of folks who are our friends. And it runs like this. Haley Barbour may be the most talented man in the Republican Party. He's good at politics. He's good with people. He's right on all the issues. He has a talent for raising money. But how can the governor of Mississippi, a man who is so much a man of the South, attract enough support in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest and the Upper Midwest to become president, even though so many of us would love to see him make a run for it? As a professional, how do you analyze your own prospects?
Well, first of all, I'm a long way from deciding to run for president. I'm not going to give it any thought till after November. My focus is on November 2nd. We can't wait till 2012 to start taking our country back. This is the election that matters. But I will give it some thought after November. And I'm sure Jimmy Carter from Georgia and Bill Clinton from Arkansas had to ask that same question. And I can tell you, I suspect, neither one of them knew what the answer was when they decided to run for president. And if I decide to run for president, I won't know what the answer is either. But I will know this. If I run for president, what you see is what you get. And, I am from Mississippi. I do have a Southern accent. I was a lobbyist and a pretty damn good one. And I'm very proud, as we were talking before the show came on. I am happy about my life. I got a great marriage. I got great family, and I've had a great career. Wouldn't do anything differently. And I will tell you this. The next president of the United States on January 21st, 2013, is going to start lobbying. He's going to be lobbying Congress. He's going to be lobbying other countries. He's going to be lobbying the business community. He's going to be lobbying the labor unions and the governors, because that's what presidents do. And I feel like it's an advantage for me to have had the chance to do that. As far as Southern accent and Mississippi, country may be looking for the anti-Obama in 2012. Don't know. Could be.
Haley Reeves Barbour, 63rd Governor of the great state of Mississippi. Thank you. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.